Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are joining us for the Connected Worker. My name is Nicole Bamford, and I'm the moderator for today's session. On behalf of Leslie, Angelique, Quinn, and I, we thank you for joining us for day one of the event. This panel presentation, Building Resilience Post-COVID-19, Digitalizing Processes to Protect Your Industrial Workforce, presentation promises to be well worth a listen and will be given by Jennifer Rogers, Head of Learning at Anglo American, Mark Hutcherson, Director Operations Excellence at ConocoPhillips, and Sandeep Ravande, CEO and co-founder of Innovaptive. Before we get started, here are some quick administrative points. During the webinar, if you have any questions for the presenters, please submit them to the Q&A box on your screen, and these will be answered during the question session after the presentation. Likewise, for any technical issues, please write them into the Q&A section, and we'll get to them right away. The widgets on your screen can be resized and dragged around for your viewing preference. We encourage you to visit the Resource Center on your screen for additional content and resources we and our sponsors have provided for you. So make sure you're sitting comfortably, and now I'll hand it over to Jennifer so we can begin.
Thanks, Nicole. Really appreciate it. It's quite an honor to be with everyone today and to be able to facilitate what should be a great panel. A few pieces around our speakers before we get started, just to give you an idea of who's sharing their knowledge with us today. We do have Sandeep Ravande with us. Nicole mentioned his name previously. Sandeep is the CEO and co-founder for Innoactive, which is a software provider focused on delivering connected worker experiences to the frontline. Prior to co-founding Innoactive in 2012, Sandeep spent several years with Big Five consulting firms, such as IBM and Accenture, to help drive digital transformation initiatives for his clients. Sandeep's clients spread across a variety of industries and verticals, including energy and natural resources. We're also joined by Mark Hutcherson. Mark is currently the Director of Operational Excellence for ConocoPhillips. Mark has 20 years of industry experience and 15 years with ConocoPhillips. In his career, he has served in various engineering, operations, and leadership roles across a diverse range of assets, onshore and offshore, in the lower 48 US, Alaska, South America, China, and Australia. And I'm Jennifer Rogers. And as Nicole already mentioned, really serve as a learning executive, specializing in global strategic workforce transformation and capability development. I've led several initiatives of a strategic nature in complex global and high-risk organizations, particularly in the compliance industries, oil and gas, mining, aviation, and financial services. I'm really passionate about leading cutting-edge innovation in the learning space, particularly as it relates to the frontline worker and the flow of work. So I'm really excited about this panel today and the great wisdom that everyone has to share. So with that said, I'd like to go ahead and get us started with the questions throughout the session. And the way that we'll work this is I'll ask a question and we'll kind of work through the three panelists together one at a time to give different insights and viewpoints with regards to what's going on in the space before we transition to the next question. So as we get to the first question, we really want to think a bit around the unprecedented times that we're in at the moment. We really do find ourselves in a place in which we're living in a time that's a little bit different than what we've experienced in the past, and we really find the need to make sure that resilience and operational efficiency are emphasized, probably more so than ever before in the industries in which we represent. From an operational perspective, my question for the group is, how is a digital space positioned to promote the agility and flexibility in our workforce while simultaneously really focusing on that compliance and accountability that's so important to drive our operational parameters and continuous improvement in the space? And I'll start by turning this over to Sandeep to give us his viewpoint around how we're dealing with this currently. Sandeep?
Thanks, Jennifer, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you guys are joining from. Really excited to be part of this panel discussion with Jennifer and Mark this morning. So as Jennifer alluded, folks, I think we are really in very unprecedented times, and operational efficiency is growing to be a much bigger priority than we have seen in the past. It's an accelerator than what we have seen in the past. And the connected worker concept by itself has been around for a while as a strategy that operational executives and digital executives have discussed. But there are three major trends that shape that strategy. Number one is the margin pressures that most companies are faced with as competitive threats, as well as survival in many cases. So the growing pressure on profit margins, combined with talent challenges, is felt across many asset-intensive industries such as CPG, life sciences, oil and gas, utilities, mining and metals, and so on. And this pressure doesn't just stem from the rising cost of people. These industries are facing increasing demand from customers to deliver high value for a much lower cost. So what we are seeing is the connected worker strategy, and the connected worker as a digital enabler is helping many companies combat these margin pressures. Jennifer, the second trend we are seeing is, which is probably the biggest one, and you being the head of learning at Anglo American, you can relate to this a lot more than anyone on this panel, is the talent challenges, right? And the talent challenges are associated with two things. One is the overall trends of the aging workforce we are seeing today across many industries. Each industry is varying, the average age is varying right now. But if you talk about oil and gas and the great crew phenomenon that we have been hearing for years now, is actually coming to life or has come to life. And in fact, we're already seeing the demographics changing in many of these companies today as we speak. And as a result of these change in demographics, what we have started to see is there's a shortage of skills gap. In fact, Manufacturing Institute predicts that there will be 2.6 million jobs unfilled by 2028 because of these skills gap, right, in the for industrial manufacturing. You take that and extrapolate that across different industries, we're going to see the same, happening. So I think these two trends, combined with where the pandemic that we are in, a strategy like the connected worker, which is about improving the working life of your frontline worker, combined with capturing accurate field data, is extremely critical to drive resilience and to also drive the operational efficiencies. We'll talk a little bit more, I'm sure, Jennifer, about talent challenges and skills gap. But at a macro level, I think those are the two big ones. And then the worker safety with new protocols, which is new procedures, new policies, and how you enforce that and enable that to drive resilience in your business is extremely crucial. So I think those are the three big macro trends we are seeing today.
Thanks, Sandeep. And I really like your emphasis on digital and the transformation aspect. You mentioned digital as an enabler. I think it may even be an imperative as we look at the future. So thank you for that. Those trends are really, really fascinating, and I think all resonate with us quite a bit. Mark, what are your take on this? What's your take on this?
Yeah, well, first of all, good morning. Good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Thanks for allowing me to share some of my thoughts with you. Yeah, I think, so some of my thoughts, I guess, to add to Sandeep's comments, really from the operator side of things, this pandemic's really given us what I see, and I'm trying to look at the silver lining here. It's given our industry really a great opportunity that we need to take advantage of. So what I mean by that is, we've gotten, hit on both sides by supply and demand. Our margins are definitely extremely pressured. There's a lot of pressure for every single operator to get efficient, increase productivity. Of course, that's always the case, right? And that was the case during the last downturn. But this one's a little bit different. This one, this is going to be a real challenge for us to overcome. A lot of companies aren't going to make it. So it's going to really force us to utilize some of those technology advances that, we've been talking about the last several years, some things that have been around for maybe 10, 15 years now. When we talk about some of these high-speed connections, the fiber we've got in the ground, all these different communication links that, yeah, we have to some extent been able to utilize, and we've progressed a bit as an industry, but I still don't think we've even come close to getting to where we could. And so now with the pandemic, there's this sense of urgency to adapt. And it's actually even forced our operations into doing things that would have taken probably years to change and to adapt to. Some of this remote working, some of the, remote control of our assets, having a lot of our operations staff actually meeting and conducting operations from their home. I mean, that's something that we would have not considered for a while, I think. So I think accelerating the adoption of some of these technologies that we're currently using during the pandemic is really going to give us an opportunity to advance some of these things, like these connected worker efforts that we've been talking about. It's going to really allow us to get folks on board. A lot of folks have opened their eyes to this, that we just needed the opportunity to kind of try some of these things out and prove it works. Now we can kind of take it to the next step and continue that progress we've made.
Thanks, Mark. And quick question for you. When you talk about the different types of technology that are being deployed, I realize there's not a silver bullet, but is there one in particular that you feel you've seen quite a bit of benefit from recently?
Well, very recently, I think it's just had a lot to do with the high-speed communication links that we've developed now in our operations. That's been huge. But I think it's also, so I think what some of the near-term things that we really need to take advantage of is truly the use of mobility and use of some of those devices that we use out in our field operations. The sooner we can, really start to utilize the platforms on there. So we've had those devices, and I think a lot of our operations folks have said, okay, this is great. And, I can get on and I can chat and I can send messages, I can take pictures, but we need, that's just kind of touching the surface, right? We need to go deeper than that. And we need to understand what are the other ways that we can better communicate and streamline our operations and our tasks that we're doing every day out in the field, utilizing some of the hardware, the devices themselves. So I think it's going to force us to consider those things and try new things that we wouldn't have done before. Even some of those direct, as I talked about, we've got some of our operations staff still working from home. Of course, we've always had our technical support, engineering staff. A lot of times they're located away from the field, but to be able to more directly connect with them, I think, is a huge opportunity as we continue to have to operate our fields and have to do it safely and have to keep our productivity up to take care of those margin pressures that Sandeep just mentioned before, right? We got to keep we got to stay at our game. We got to just continue to find new ways to innovate, find new ways to utilize what we're already doing a lot in our personal lives.
Sure. And just to kind of add to that, to round out the perspective, we've talked a lot about the trends. We've talked a lot about the technology. I think one of the things that's really important is also the scalability that Mark, you just started to talk about. And from my perspective, there are a few pieces that I think are really important for us to think about as we're thinking about how we ensure that agility and flexibility that we need for our workforce. As we look at the technology and the ways in which we reach our workers, our connected colleagues, so to speak, in the space, there are a few additional things that I think we have to consider. One is enterprise content management. When we're looking at processes that we're driving in the workplace and we look at the ways in which we're trying to reach our colleagues alongside their work, we need to think about the ways in which we're standardizing processes and making them accessible across the board. That's obviously very important for us as we look at version control, ISO requirements and audits, and the ways in which we consistently get efficient information to people, not only reflecting the local scenario, but also the ways in which we're driving operational excellence across the organization. I think the second point that kind of goes along with that enterprise content management, in which we have standardized standard operating procedures that can be deployed in the flow of work to our colleagues, we also have to consider a bit around experience. So what is the experience that really makes sense for our different colleagues in the ways in which they work in different assets, in different geographies, people with different backgrounds? How are we actually delivering that information, those schematics, those standard operating procedures, remote operation support to those colleagues in a way in which is accessible to them and really relevant in the ways in which they work? I think those are things that we have to explore as well. And then finally, as we start to look at the ways in which we scale this and we make real, true content and experience come together for our colleagues in the way in which we work, we really need to focus quite a bit on the data management around that as well. What kind of data are we collecting? There's great advancements in the space, for example, with regards to XAPI and things of that nature that give us great data coming back around how our colleagues are experiencing and interacting with one another, with systems, with equipment, with processes and SOPs. And I think that's an important piece for us as well to make sure that we're focused on as we move into the future. So,
yeah, Jennifer,
go ahead, Sandeep. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to go add a couple of cents there and on the experience side, because I think that's a critical one and tied back to scalability, right? Because we have seen our solutions being deployed to our customers, and the challenges they face is with scaling that up across different demographics, sites, geographies. And what we have found is, what is really critical is the obsessive focus on the end user in terms of improving the working life of that end user. Because a lot of us, in the corporate world are thinking about capturing data in the field. We're saying, hey, I need all that data in the field, so this is what you're supposed to do to get me that data, right? But it's all about that end user's experience. If you can change his working life, you can get both the adoption and scalability and also the field data that you're trying to capture. And it's really critical to be able to think in those lines as you think of the strategy. So I really completely align with what you mentioned. Thanks.
Absolutely. Sandeep, and you transitioned beautifully to our next line of questioning. You brought up something that I think is really important, which is we can talk about our processes and being lean and efficient, as well as continuous improvement of tech, equipment, processes across the board. But we would be remiss to not really focus on people. We know people are the critical driver around the transformation of our organizations. And sometimes we jump straight from, straight into talking about digital tech and equipment and all of those pieces. So let's talk about people for a few minutes here. I want to spend some time really focusing on our frontline colleagues, the workforce that's actually driving production for all of our organizations. This is a question for everyone. What strategies do you all see that you think we need to consider when ensuring the safety, the well-being, and the development of our colleagues? And not only just their safety, well-being, and development for today, but also as we look into the future and the future of work. What do we need to consider? What are you really seeing in your organization that we all need to focus on as we kind of wrap our minds around the connected worker to begin this session this week? Mark, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. So, I've got a presentation, I think it's Wednesday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern, where I'm going to be talking a bit more about this. But, really, I see that a lot too, that you mentioned technology, kind of just going straight to the technology, because that's the fun, cool, sexy part of it, right? And that's pretty easy to do because you've got people, vendors calling you left and right, look at this cool gadget, look at that. And it's really cool. It's really exciting. It's fun. It's pretty easy to get some of those things off the ground. But part of what, I do it in my position as I'm working with the different BUs and talking to them about some of their near-term goals and some of their long-term goals and trying to connect that up with kind of our corporate strategy, really it's important to kind of to step back and start with, what's your overall problem statement out in either in your business or out in your field operations? Like what do you need to survive for the next 5 or 10 years? What do you need to do as an organization? Kind of just think very big picture. And then once you've done that, you can kind of step into, all right, in order to get there, these are some of the near-term things we're working on, making sure that they're aligning and they're kind of, at least thinking out and then hopefully building out somewhat of a roadmap or a pathway there to help to eventually prioritize what are these different aspects that we need to be tackling. But then at the same time, and that's still kind of from a business or a management perspective, right? You also got to be thinking about those immediate pain points like you discussed with frontline workers. Sandeep talked about that. If you don't give them a better experience, if you don't make their day better somehow with the use of these tools, or if you're going to end up capturing more data, how can you make that experience easier for them? So that's really important. And so that's where you can start to really get some of that buy-in at the ground level, because that's really where it's going to take off, and that's where that scalability ability can start to happen. But so the tech's not going to drive the value alone. I think we all understand that. You got to have the right culture, the right behaviors, and start developing some of those refined work processes and kind of adjust your operating model to go along to enable some of that technology to actually work for you. So on the training and skill development front, we really need our workers to understand, I think this is starting to get through, but I think it's still a challenge that these digital technologies, you're not going to just have these robots coming out and replacing them tomorrow. We're not really talking about that when we're talking about especially some of these near-term advancements. Yeah, we talk a little bit about automation. We try to talk about keeping our workforce level with not, having, as we're expanding our well count, not expanding the number of operators in parallel, right? We want to try to establish and maintain a pretty flat head count while we continue to grow our operations. In order to do that, that's how we got to utilize some of this technology. And so getting that in their heads that the technology is not a replacement, but also being very transparent, saying that your skill sets will have to evolve because of this, right? So I think what companies, what organizations have to do to accommodate that is provide some of the training and skill development that is needed to help those skill sets evolve. Put in the proper supervision and management that's able to work with your frontline to make sure that they understand that, again, it's not looking to replace your job, but there is a need to transition what you do in the coming years if we are going to adopt some of these digital technologies. And I think as long as that conversation's happening and as long as the organization is providing those skills and some of that to help our frontline workers, I think that's a recipe for success longer term.
Great. Thanks, Mark. And Sandeep, you have some things I think you want to share with us around this as well that you alluded to in our previous question.
Yeah,
what does this look like from your perspective?
Yeah, so I think, getting the connected worker strategy right requires people, process, and the technology. And I always say this to our internal teams, right? Technology was created by humans. It can be dumb or intelligent based on how we define it. And people and process make it intelligent, right? So we're absolutely right. The question that is spot on in here is, digital is not the way to get started. You need to make sure that there's a culture built around this. And there's a sense of adoption and ownership that comes along with it. So let's spend about a couple of minutes, Jennifer, talking about that, because you alluded that in the previous question, right? So when you talk about adoption, you talk about experiences. Something that improves the working life of your frontline worker is what the technology is going to be, adopted by them. That's the only kind of technology that will be adopted by them. And if you think of what is needed for them to get the job done, they need step-by-step work instructions in terms of what they need to go out and carry out, like go fix the pump, how to fix the pump, how do I go step 1, step 2, step 3 through visuals, through different videos or whatnot. So that's when digital will be given a lot of importance, because it's improving the working life of that individual versus just capturing, say, work order or notification information in PNS. But that's data that the corporate wants, which is back office, entry, versus the work instructions that is helping the frontline work. Now, in addition to that, when you think about how the different elements of environmental health and safety procedures and policies that need to keep the workers safe, there are different ways of thinking about this, right? There are certainly, you roll these procedures out through the people, through processes, through organizational structures, but then, digital can play a really critical in enabling that, right? So especially when you're in these unprecedented times, being able to track the location of your workers and being able to share that location and their well-being with others through mobile technologies, that can track that and share that information across, brings a lot of information through digital, which can enforce your policies and procedures that you were highlighting earlier. In addition, we're also seeing, when you think about digital and you think about technology to enable your frontline worker to be safe, you also need to recognize that the environmental factors you're dealing with is constantly evolving and it's dynamic, not just in today's scenario with COVID-19, but then overall the regulatory pressures on these asset-intensive industries are pretty dynamic as we learn, as the regulations learn new things, new changes. So being able to incorporate that in your standard operating procedures to keep your workers safe and cross-secting the digital with them is extremely critical in the well-being of the people that you overlook. Right? There are several other examples sure we'll cover in the conversation here.
Thanks, Sandeep. And just to kind of round out this question from my perspective, obviously this is one that's near and dear to my heart, being a learning professional. But as we look at our workforce, I think that there are a few other things that kind of help pull all of these threads together. Once again, really focused on scalability within the organization and the consistent ability for all of our colleagues to develop in the ways in which they need to continue to grow, because we are conscious of the fact that the space is changing, that the skills of today are not the skills of tomorrow. We have to proactively develop our people ahead of that change. And so a few other bullet points that I would kind of add to the discussion here, and I know several of us will be speaking about this in more detail throughout the week in our individual sessions, but one of them really has to do with enterprise capability management. And when we talk about capability, we're talking about something a little different than the static competency models that have existed in the past. We're actually talking about dynamic ways in which we're constantly getting new insights through AI and human validation that help us to understand what capability is required for our workforce and the ways in which we systematically are developing people ahead of that change. There's a way to do that, and that's a piece that I think organizations need to focus on right now, rather than just adopting a fixed static skills model or competency model, really putting into place true enterprise capability management so that we can actually recognize the diversity that exists in our workforce and not give them a one-size-fits-all. It's all about that experience that Sandeep talked about before, the ways in which we can actually identify the person, identify what piece of equipment or part of the process they're operating, and really provide the experience specific to them to accelerate their development and move them forward. I think another piece that's really important around this is the predictive and adaptive nature of learning and the ways in which we reach our workforce. We have the technology at this point. I think Mark mentioned that as well, do this. But it's really about the people. Again, we have great IoT data telling us all kinds of things around operational parameters in our equipment and our processes. And that's giving us great information and visualization back in terms of whether things are performing in the ways in which we would expect them to. However, what we're really missing in some cases is the connection between that IoT data and the person that's actually operating that, that part of the process. There's a way to meet those up and actually look at when parameters are not what we would expect them to be, how we can actually engage the person that is in that vicinity or in that operational context and give them exactly what they need as a person to make the right decisions in that situation. With that comes remote coaching and assessment. I believe Sandeep's talked a little bit about that, but the ways in which we can identify what people are operating, what their skill set is, what decisions need to be taken, and when they might need connection to a remote colleague or subject matter expert that can look at what they're seeing in real time and give them practical feedback that can either coach them through a decision or even assess their skill level at that particular time. So I think those are all emerging trends as well with regards to the space. Conscious of the fact that we've got some questions from our audience, but before we do that, I want to put all of us on the spot on the panel and just very quickly go through one question together. And I've prepared everybody for this, so we all know that it's coming. But we've talked a little bit about tech and digital and transformation and processes. We've talked a little bit about people and the workforce. And I think what a lot of organizations are trying to figure out in this moment, particularly in our current context, is the intersection between those two. So if we're thinking about scalable success and the organizations that that are represented in this conference this week, walk us through some practical first steps that you think that organizations can put into place today that can help them make some significant steps toward really deploying connected worker capability at scale in their organizations. Sandeep, can you start us off and just give us a few practical pieces that our colleagues may want to think about?
Sure. I'm going to again start with the end user, Jennifer. So the user personas of your enterprise is extremely critical to understand, right? And when I say user personas, if you have a workforce of 2,000, 5,000, 5,000 frontline workers, understanding the user persona groups by demographics or by specific sites that they work, or different variables and characteristics of those demographics, and being able to group them is extremely critical, because not all frontline workers are equal in your enterprise. They're different by site, by age, by different gender, etc. So being able to understand that user persona is extremely critical. And once you know that user persona and what their likes are, what their dislikes are, you need to create group-based change management programs, right? So the change management program and a strategy in terms of how we are going to tackle each of those groups to be able to drive the necessary, adoption as well as, championship that you require within those groups. But the way I've seen most companies do it is they go in with a big change management strategy, they get the user personas, being able to group them into different personas, and then have a strategy around those personas is typically what has been done traditionally. And what I strongly recommend our customers to do now is to actually think about the user persona and group them correctly. To drive a change management strategy combined with stakeholder buy-in, right? In many companies now, we are actually seeing the connected worker imperative coming straight from the CEO because of the not only the operational efficiencies, but the impact it's going to have in terms of the talent gaps and skills challenges over the next 5 to 7 years. Change management is going to be the number one, in my opinion, right? And you all are spot on. Technology is not the silver bullet. You got to be thinking of people and process, and then change management as a strategy should be thought from day one, even before you get into an initiative like a connect. Second is, I think, the buy-in. The stakeholder buy-ins is so critical, right? So if you don't have your executives on board, and this is being driven as a small pilot, in some site and another site, it's not going to scale because you don't have an executive buy-in. So You need to be able to, build your business case, your return on investment, and then, I'm sure in some of the sessions today and tomorrow, we're going to have, some sessions on ROI and business case. But then when you're able to do that, build the change management strategy, and then talk about overall financial benefits and safety of your frontline worker, you will get your executive buy-in. So change management and the executive buy-in are critical. And then the third one is quick wins, right? I mean, you need to be able to show with the smallest amount of investment a quick return. So we spoke about those user groups in a change management strategy. You could pick your frontline worker group that is most likely to succeed and embrace and adopt. Being able to show that quick win in relatively a small amount of time, being able to show those financial benefits, and then multiply that at scale across different user groups in a change management strategy will be able to get your executives to get further buy-in and investment into it. Quick wins are really critical. And then the fourth one is agility, right? So when you're thinking about how you go about building the solution out, you need to be thinking about companies that can provide technologies and capability that can help you respond to changes and needs of different user personas and groups at lightning speed, which means, if there's a change that an end user needs in order to improve his working life, that change must be instant now. It shouldn't be a 3-month request to IT and then IT comes back. You lose all the attention and adoption from people. So I think those are the 4 areas typically I advise our clients to think about. Technology is just an enabler, but you've got to build these capabilities around the technology to drive it at scale, to your question, Jennifer.
Thanks, Sandeep. And Mark, I'm sure you have some thoughts for us as well. We've got some great questions from the audience I'd like to address too. But any practical tips you have for us? What could I do now as an organization to really start to move in this direction?
Just briefly, so all of his points are great, so I won't add much to any of them because I think they're all valid. The only other one I would add that I could think of was around, just the knowledge sharing across your organization, especially if you have a large global organization, or if you have lots of different areas even that you operate even within one country. You can get a lot of disparate processes, and they all want to go off and kind of do their own thing, and it makes a lot of sense. And it made a lot of sense a long time ago when we didn't have all of these different technologies and ability to connect. So I think really one other thing we need to do to progress this is establishing those knowledge sharing networks, establish some of those really strong networks across your different assets where they actually have the ability to talk about common issues, developing some common goals. And then that way, maybe they can establish some of those, early wins, and they'll be able to more readily scale that. So that's, I think setting that up initially will really help out on the adoption and scalability if you can solve problems for multiple assets at once.
Thanks, Mark. And just a few things from my end to add around this. I think one of the things that organizations can start to do now is think about your organizational taxonomy. And by that, I don't mean the ways in which your organization is organized, not your business units, but the disciplines that are required to do the work, both now and in the future, and the ways in which you need to organize that to be dynamic and flexible as you move into the future. I think another point that I really stress to organizations that's really critically important is multimodal, multi-channel experiences. By that, I really mean, how are you engaging people based upon their educational background, the languages they speak, the geography, the actual work that they do, and building things once in a way in which it can be deployed in all of those different modalities, in all of those different ways to people at one time, and really getting away from this inefficiency around, working on building SOPs, standard operating procedures, and building e-learning, and building guides, and building manuals, and then having remote operations separate from all of that. We don't have the time to do that anymore. So strategies to actually build once and deploy in multiple modalities and channels from one source. And then I think the last thing, and I've spoken about this already, is XAPI. It's an amazing data source and structure that really gives the opportunity to look at a subject, verb, object type of data structure. What did the person do to, to what piece of equipment or in what part of the process, in what context? It gives us an amazing data source to actually evaluate the ROI around our investment and make sure that we're targeted in the right way. And typically organizations are still maturing around their use of XAPI and the ways in which they're utilizing it to drive their decisions. So I think those are all things that are, practical points that can be explored at this point, now more so than ever. At this point, I'd like to transition to some of the questions that our colleagues have been asking. And so I'd like to go ahead and throw this one out to the group. It's a great question. So let me go ahead and push this forward so that everyone can see it. The question is a really insightful one. It's basically asking, yes, we're in a pandemic, all these things are happening. We're trying all of these things and pulling things together. How much of this technology do we think will stick versus reverting back to the way we used to work after the pandemic is behind us? Any thoughts behind that from my colleagues?
I mean, I'll go first, and the quick answer for me is I don't really know at this stage. I mean, that's a really good question. I think that's what all of us are, a lot of us are pondering in our different organizations, because I could see that happen, and it's happened before, right? It's happened with downturns, for example, right? Where we, shave off costs and we get streamlined, get more efficient. And then, oil price or commodity price goes back up and these things sneak back in, right? Or inefficiencies. So I don't have an answer for that. I just think it's a really good question. I think it's a challenge that we need to have in the forefront of our minds to be thinking about ways which we can address this. Because I think it probably will be a bit of a different formula for each organization based on your leadership, based on your company culture and the different behaviors. So.
Yep. So Jennifer, from my perspective, that's, by the way, a really good question. The new ways of working and the new normal, right? We're already seeing decisions being made, at least from tech companies, right? If you see Twitter, Facebooks of the world, they've actually already announced that, they're going to be retiring some of their office buildings and actually making remote working the new norm, right? And then you go into even system integrators like Wipro in India and others, they've started to announce work from home policy that they were never used to in the past, which means the humans are getting used to working in a remote kind of environment, just like we're doing here, with video and so on. And the new normal is accepted by people. The decisions are coming. And I believe even for the frontline worker, we will see a new way of working in the future, even post-pandemic, because it's more efficient, period. Forget about the pandemic. It's just more efficient. For example, I mean, how many of us have ever thought of deploying proactively, a wearable smart glass for your frontline worker to do a two-way video conference call before the pandemic? Never. But then if you look at the financial benefits of not having to fly an expert technician to the site and actually have him, side by side to provide over-the-shoulder coaching, can be totally avoided even post-pandemic, right? So I don't see it separate. I think what's happening is the human is conditioning itself. All of us are conditioning ourselves to accept the new ways of working. And the new ways of working is yielding some efficient ways of interacting with each other. And if it can drive those financial benefits, I think it will be the new normal, in my opinion. But that may change. But we're already seeing trends going in that direction.
Great. Thanks, Sandeep. One more quick question. I'm going to ask everyone to respond with just one response because I think it's a great one. I'm going to modify the question a bit. But the question is really around if there was one skill, this actually asks for multiple, but I'm going to ask you for one skill that you think that we really need to focus on in our workforce with regards to really investing on in terms of development. What is that one skill that you think would be the most critical?
Yeah. Jennifer, this is for you and Mark. I think you guys are the best ones to answer.
Sure. I'll kick us off just before we close. I think from my perspective, really looking at general social process skills, the way in which we collaborate and team and negotiate, as well as commercial skills in terms of value chain. And then furthermore, obviously, more technical and digital skills as we move forward. What about you, Mark?
Yeah, so off the top of my head, most important for me would be that ability to question, that ability to have like an innovative culture, and to really embed that into your organization, to always be having folks ask, you know, is this really the best way to be doing things? Why am I doing this? If they've got an idea, being able to submit that very easily to someone, and actually promoting that way of working. I think that's overall probably the biggest thing that I think could change our organizations.
Thanks, Mark. Super insightful. And thanks to all of my colleagues for an amazing panel. So much expertise in this panel, and I know everyone is sharing more throughout the week. Thank you guys so much for your collaboration, and for our audience, thanks for listening. I hope you've gotten some pieces of information that kind of guide your thinking as we move forward.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, Mark, and Sandeep, for that interesting and informative webinar. For those in the audience, if you'd like to listen again, the webinar will be available on demand shortly. Finally, thank you to you, the audience, wherever you are, for taking the time to listen in, and remember to check out more of our upcoming and on-demand webinars at oilandgasiq.com. We'll see you at the next one.